Hi everyone, Casey Irvine here, and today I want to talk to you about an agentic pattern that my team and I have been exploring that I think you might find useful, but it does have some caveats and some gotchas. So we're going to talk about what that pattern is, when to use it, how to use it, and what to watch out for. So for lack of any kind of official term, I've been calling this pattern the agent skill pattern. Um, so I have a whole video on what agents are and what skills are, but just quickly, agents we tend to think of as personas that we want to take on to do some work in an agentic harness, and skills are usually like defined tasks or um, definitions of how we want things done that kind of fit into a series of steps or processes. So kind of a rough mapping. I tend to think of agents as almost like classes if you're thinking it in an object-oriented way, and skills are functions. Now, obviously, you can have skills that map to different agents and things like that. So it's not a perfect example, but just in terms of like scope and how they're used, I kind of tend to think of things that way. But what the agent skill pattern is you take something that would be a skill and implement it as an agent. And typically you do this with a cheaper model and a defined set of tools. And so the benefits of using this agent skill, and here I'm just going to make a little benefits section here, especially when we think of this agent that's going to implement this skill as being a subagent, you get isolated context. So if we think about this in terms of you have some larger task, and it's executing a series of steps, and maybe for one of those steps, you've implemented an agent skill or the agent skill pattern. Um, the overall agent or session that is going through your series of steps is going to invoke your agent skill as a subagent, and in doing so, it's going to sort of isolate the context needed for that work that the agent skill is going to execute, and it doesn't muddy your parent context with that. So this is one of the reasons why you would want to use agent skill versus just a skill, is because you're going to isolate that context and not bloat the context of the parent session or agent, especially when it's evoked as a subagent. Um, and so by using a cheaper model, even if you maybe use more tokens, you can usually save some money, or some credits. So if you have tuned your tasks or your skills such that your agent skills can use a sufficiently cheaper model, you can save credits than if you had let the original, probably larger model that's executing this complex task operate on that. And then uh, also by using a defined set of tools, um, you also get some reduced context, so you don't get the full context bloat of using all the tools that are available to your parent session. But another benefit that you can get sometimes is you get some time savings as well. So if you've tuned things appropriately, and this isn't always the case, but sometimes by using that cheaper model, it'll actually execute that task faster than if you had let the parent session with, again, probably a larger model. So you can get some time savings. Now, I will say in my testing, you typically get the benefit of isolated context in almost all cases, where you don't have a lot of context ending up in the parent that you wouldn't necessarily need to. You don't always save money depending on the scenario, and you don't always save time either. So it is important that if you're going to use this pattern, you test and make sure that you're getting the benefits that you want out of it, because these are sort of the theoretical benefits. I'll even put in theory here, but they're not guaranteed benefits. So you do have to watch out for this. So the other thing I'll mention is the reason that we implement this in an agent is because in most harnesses, it's agents and agent front matter that allows us to define what the model is and what the set of tools are. And again, normally we think of that in terms of safety as what tools the agent is allowed to invoke. But here we're thinking of it in terms of context bloat, in this isolated context where I can give my subagent, my agent skill agent, just the tools that it needs to call. So its context isn't filled up with a bunch of metadata about tools that it's not ever going to need to use for the skill that it's implementing. And the other thing I want to call out is that if you're a Claude Code user, Claude Code skills and the front matter for those skills already kind of has some of these things built in. So you don't necessarily need to do this pattern with an agent. You can just pick the right front matter for your skill that specifies the model, and if you want to fork the context, and if it's invocable by a user. So Claude Code's kind of a little bit ahead of some of the other harnesses in that it kind of already has a way to implement this pattern inline in the skills. So definitely check that out. But some of the same gotchas and things we're going to talk about apply here. But just know that if you're using Claude Code, you don't necessarily need to implement this as a separate agent to get the same benefits or pattern out of that, which is super nice. And I'm sure other harnesses are going to follow suit in the coming months, just because I think this pattern is going to become more common as folks look to maximize their tokens and efficiency. So let me draw a diagram of what this might look like. So I have my, I'm going to color this blue here. I have my parent agent or session. In fact, actually, I'm just going to say agent or session, because this is like if I open up, the Copilot CLI or the GitHub app, and I start a new session, like you get the coding agent or the default agent. It's the same with other harnesses, and we start the session. And then so once I start that session, it's going to start executing some things. So step 1, step 2. But let's say that for step 3, we recognize that we have an AgentSkill for this. So I'm going to make this box a little wider so it fits. And by we, I mean the harness recognizes that there's an AgentSkill available. So in that case, it's going to invoke our AgentSkill agent. Oops. I want the new box here. There we go. So here is our AgentSkill agent. There we go. So to do that, obviously, it's gonna pass some information. It's gonna pass some context, and I might even need to move this over a bit. Actually, let me select the whole thing before I move it. Here we go. There. So it's gonna pass some context and plus like the task it wants it to perform. So our AgentSkill happily executes the task. And then it returns that summary back to the parent agent. And let's say that this parent agent was waiting on that summary to execute the next step. So then now that it has that result from the AgentSkill, it can now continue on to step 4 and continue on to step 5. But it has executed that step 3 at a much more efficient rate than it would have itself, because of some of the benefits that we just talked about. So that executes in this context. It executes with the cheaper model, so it's using less AI credits. And if the agent session really just needed the summary, and that's a big if, like it really needs to be able to be isolated to where all it needs is the summary of what happened, or the result of this agent to continue on with its work, then you see the benefits of this step 3 being done with the AgentSkill. Let me see. So what my team has as a good example of this is we have a pipeline RCA agent. So whenever a pipeline fails, we have an agent that can go and sort of investigate that, pull the logs for the pipelines. It knows some specifics about our pipelines and where to find logs and different Azure resources and things like that. And then it can return that summary back to the agent or the session that's probably trying to fix that pipeline. So if the parent agent is trying to fix that pipeline, but it doesn't need to necessarily know anything other than the RCA or the root cause to fix that pipeline, it doesn't need to waste its context pulling different log files in, searching through build history, searching through runs and run definitions, searching through logs and Azure resources. Like it just needs the key details so that it can go and fix that. And then, yeah, we've definitely had to do some tuning of the model that we use, but we have tuned it to where we're pretty confident that the model we use is cheaper and can perform that task. And the key is that this session here isn't loading context that this session needs to load. So in some of the sort of trivial test cases that I had for this pattern where let's say this agent is trying to write code, but then when it comes time to write tests, you want to shim out to an AgentSkill agent. The problem is that there's probably going to be some duplicate context between what this agent needed to load to write those tests and what this agent needed to load to write those tests. And so you end up kind of like already having what you needed in context anyway. And so you end up like, yes, it saves you and you get the isolated context, but at the end of the day, that extra sort of back and forth with the LLM ends up not really saving you money and can also mean that you don't necessarily save time, even with the cheaper model. So typically these is best done when your tasks are sort of well isolated and the context necessary to do those tasks don't overlap. There's definitely some gotchas here that you want to be aware of. We have also found that sometimes the harness doesn't always discover this agent to call it. And what can help is if you add a skill that points or routes to that agent. So it's just kind of like a little wrapper skill that you add here so that the harness and will pass this to the LLM with some summary so that the LLM will invoke it, kind of like a tool call. And that can just help the LLM discover this this agent, this subagent, a little bit easier. And this doesn't always work, but we just find that like when we have a skill for the subagents that we want to be invoked as subagents, that it has a better chance of being invoked. So if you find that you implement this pattern and your subagent isn't getting invoked, you might want to try wrapping it in a skill or having like an agents.md or an instruction file that kind of points out more explicitly that you have this agent and what it should be used for. And sometimes you have like a routing file that lists your agents and how they should be routed to. This is just kind of another way to do that, but we find that this works pretty well. And with that, that pretty much sums up the agent skill pattern. I will have a companion blog post with this to maybe show a little bit more of the details of the front matter and go into a little bit more depth of how this works. But this is the broad overview. Please give me feedback, or if you know of this pattern by a different name. Again, Claude Code kind of already has this built into skills, which is really cool. But definitely would love to hear about how folks have maybe already implemented this pattern or have done something similar. So definitely feel free to drop some comments and let me know what you think. All right, thanks everyone. Happy coding.